The Egyptian Levites turn to monotheism. We begin in Egypt around 3,600 years ago. An Egyptian priestly family named Levi adopt the monotheistic ideology of the descendants of the patriarch Jacob, who had come down from Canaan with his family to Egypt. Moses and Aaron were two brothers from this Levite family. Moses became a wholehearted believer in the one God as professed by the monotheistic family of Jacob. His brother Aaron also became a monotheist, but maintained his respect for the Egyptian animal sacrificial cult, a cult that he devoted to the one God. The sons of Jacob were subjected to a cruel slavery by the Pharaoh of Egypt, and Moses, who was in Midian, a neighboring state, received a command by God to lead the monotheistic slaves out of Egypt. Around 1500 BCE, an enormous volcano erupted at Mount Thera in today's Greece that caused enormous damage to most countries in the eastern part of the Mediterranean region. Egypt was covered with debris that made the Nile turn red, frogs and vermin to accumulate, and a period of total darkness to occur. The administrative control of Pharaoh collapsed, and Moses led the slave community that he was associated with out of Egypt. When the climactic situation calmed a little, Pharaoh sent his military in chariots to bring back the fleeing slaves and, near the Reed Sea, a tsunami that was initiated by the volcanic eruption at Thera in Greece drowned the chariot force. Evidently, the Egyptian chariots were in a low-lying region, flooded by the tsunami, while the fleeing slaves were at a higher elevation, where the tsunami did not pass. Israel, in English, Strugglers for God, was the name given by Moses to the newly liberated nation. The signs and wonders associated with the Exodus were natural, but, at the same time, awesome. The newly freed slaves were told that the one Creator, God, had liberated them from Egypt. There were no myths, magic, or unnatural miracles, as described in the book of Exodus. There was God, acting through nature, as described in the book of Deuteronomy. In the text of Deuteronomy, Moses does not even possess a magic rod, let alone use it. Horeb and the Ten Commandments. Israel, the new monotheistic nation, reached Horeb, as Deuteronomy calls Sinai. God gave to Moses and Israel the Ten Commandments. This event probably took place at a local volcano in the Horeb area and during a great deal of seismic activity. The Ten Commandments can be seen as a summary of the way that the new nation should conduct itself during the wilderness travels. These commandments can also be seen as an excellent basic guidance today for correct living. The Ten Commandments were, however, an introductory document prior to the climax of Moses' life at Mount Nebo, before his death, and the key covenant made, at that time, for Israel's long-term settlement of the Promised Land. The Tent of Assembly. There were no animal sacrificial rites during the wilderness epoch. Amos 5:25, Jeremiah 7:22. If so, what was the function of the Tent of Assembly? Ochel Moed. It was, as the name suggests, a tent of assembly, a place where Israelite leaders met with Moses and conducted the activities related to traveling in the wilderness. The tent initially contained the Ark of the Covenant, a wooden cupboard that in it were placed the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Later, a scroll with the text of the Covenant of Nebo written on it was placed at the side of the ark. Deuteronomy 31:26. There was no animal sacrificial altar, no gold-coated electrostatically charged device, no Holy of Holies, and no incense altar. These later items were a part of the Egyptian-style sacrificial cult introduced by the sons of Aaron priests during the Judges period. The tent of assembly was a tent of assembly during the wilderness epoch. The Covenant of Nebo. The climax of the divine revelation to Moses and Israel came at Mount Nebo, in the plains of Moab, on the east side of the Jordan River, opposite Jericho. The Covenant of Nebo, between God, Moses, and Israel, focused on the love of God with all your heart, soul, and might. It began with Deuteronomy chapter 6 and continued with chapters 8, 11, 28, and ended with chapter 30. The Covenant of Nebo stressed the love of God by the nation of Israel, while the Ten Commandments, an introductory code, did not mention the love of God. Neither do the Pentateuch of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, make any mention of the love of God. Moses wrote the Covenant of Nebo, while judges, kings, sacrificial priests wrote the Pentateuch, hundreds of years after the death of Moses, as we now will discuss. The Judges period sacrificial cults. After the death of Moses and Joshua, two sacrificial cults began functioning in the newly formed Israelite homeland. 1. The High Places, Bama cult, adopted the indigenous Canaanite sacrificial cult and worshipped there Baal, Ashtoreth, and the God of Israel. Later, the solar disk, Hema, was added to the High Places/popular cult pantheon. The Matseva at the high place, a symbol of the Canaanite god Baal, became a symbol of the God of Israel. The vast bulk of the nation Israel associated with the hundreds of high places that were established all over Israel. Exodus 20:21-23 outlines the basic layout of a high place. 2. The Aaronid temple cult. Aaron and his sons were monotheists who believed that God should be worshipped with an Egyptian-style animal sacrificial cult. At around 10 temples, mainly in the south of Israel, Aaronid priests conducted this Egyptian-style sacrificial cult. The wilderness tent of assembly was converted into an Aaronid temple and used for animal sacrifices. The books of Exodus chapters 25-40 and most of Leviticus described in detail the Aaronid sacrificial temple site and its rituals. It should be noted that the Aaronid priests split from the rest of the tribe of Levi early in the settlement period. The Levite tribe remained loyal to the non-sacrificial ways of the Torah of Moses, preserving the Covenant of Nebo and the agricultural towns that they lived. Leviticus 25:32. Judges period Israel was a polarized society with the three cultically different groups: the High Places cult, the Aaronid temple cult, and the Levite tribe coexisting together. The Torah Prophets of the first millennia BCE utterly rejected all animal sacrifices as polytheistic, including both the High Places and the Aaronid temple cults. Moses, the pure monotheist. Moses was a pure monotheist who wrote most of the book of Deuteronomy. He loved the one God, and during his life, there were no animal sacrifices, no bodily mutilation, and no burial cults. He was not involved with myths, magic, angels, or unnatural miracles. The Torah of Moses, Deuteronomy, was a text of prophetic revelation and expressed the love and loyalty between God and Israel, a man and his wife, children and their parents, your neighbor and the resident alien, ger, in your midst. The Torah prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, Malachi, Joel, Obadiah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, 2nd Isaiah, Nahum, and Zephaniah, together with most of the tribe of Levi, supported this Torah way of life. God is in search of man is the term that A.J. Heschel used to describe the way of the Torah Prophets. In contrast, the first 4 books of the Hebrew Bible can be described as the writings of man in search of God. Sometimes these sacrificial, priestly writers presented respectable historical and legal material, while on other occasions they focused on animal sacrificial practices. The books of Psalms and Proverbs are examples of mostly reverent, man in search of God expression. Moses did not write chapter 12 of the book of Deuteronomy. This chapter was focused on centralization of an animal sacrificial cult and was an editorial addition in the 7th century BCE. Conclusions. There are 3 questions that the academic community have not fully discussed. 1. How was an Egyptian-style temple cult adopted by the early Israelites? Aaron and his sons brought the sacrificial cult with them from Egypt and dedicated it to the God of Israel. 2. Why did the early Israelites so quickly and extensively adopt the high places Canaanite sacrificial cult? 4 sons of Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Joseph, and Benjamin, went down to Egypt. The Levites were an Egyptian priestly family who adopted the monotheism of the sons of Jacob. On arriving in Canaan, 6 local Canaanite groups, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan adopted the monotheism of the victorious Israelites at a ceremony led by Joshua and Shechem. It must also be noted that Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, remained in Canaan and did not go down to Egypt. The monotheistic house of Judah reunited with the descendants of Jacob when they returned to Canaan. The 6 Canaanite groups continued their sacrificial way at their high places in Israel, linking Baal, their god, to the God of Israel. Many of the other Israelites joined in this cult and offered animal sacrifices at the hundreds of Bamot established in Judges, Kings period Israel. 3. How could it be that there was no animal sacrifices in the wilderness period and that the book of Deuteronomy, with the exception of chapter 12, does not focus on animal sacrifices? Moses wrote most of the book of Deuteronomy, and he was a pure monotheistic who did not accept any animal sacrificial activity. The diction of Deuteronomy was also archaic, being the earliest language in the Hebrew Bible. The study of the Torah of Moses and the prophets is very important today. You cannot love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might, while at the same time be respectful or devoted to animal sacrificial cults. One should, I believe, utterly reject these cults just as the Torah Prophets did around 2,800 years ago. We should have 0 tolerance to animal sacrifice and thus be able to wholeheartedly return to and love the God of Israel. We should also be this worldly in our religious thinking as the Hebrew Bible was. Dualistic speculation about life after death and other worldly, eschatological scenarios with angels, demons, heaven, purgatory, and hell should not be part of our Torah ethos. We should each love God as individuals, as no detailed instruction can be offered as to how this love should be expressed. We should worship God in a community that we can feel ideologically at home in. One Torah-focused organization is the United Israel World Union, and the Deuteronomic Community, my association, feels at one with the United Israel. The email address of the Deuteronomic Community is deut.com@mail.com. One can read a fuller discussion of the above views in the Historical Moses Found, written by Barry Page. Barry J. Page at live.com.au. The historical Moses was a far greater prophetic leader than the miracle-performing person with a magic rod as presented in the book of Exodus. He was a pure monotheist who professed the love of God and wrote most of the book of Deuteronomy. Returning to him today is critical for all of us to further the coming of the end of days for all mankind as described in the Hebrew Bible.